Summary of The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Maggie and Tom Tulliver, two siblings who grew up in the fictional town of St. Ogg's, Lincolnshire, England, serve as the main characters in The Mill on the Floss. The story focuses on their upbringing and early adulthood. The unknown narrator, whose gender is never said, has a dream about Dorlcote Mill, the ancient home of the Tulliver family, where a little girl is playing outside. Maggie Tulliver turns out to be the name of the little girl. Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver are talking about Tom's schooling inside the house. Mr. Tulliver says he didn't go to school much himself, but he wants to send Tom to school in hopes that Tom will go into business. Mr. Riley plans to send Tom to study with Mr. Stelling, a preacher who went to Oxford, because a family friend told him to. Maggie is so happy when her bigger brother Tom comes home from school to see her. She loves Tom so much. But when he gets back, Tom is mad at her because she didn't take care of his mice while he was gone. He says that he saved up his money to buy her a gift, while she forgot to feed the rabbits and let them die because she didn't care. Maggie says she's sorry a lot and is upset by Tom's anger, so he ends up forgiving her. Also visiting are Mrs. Tulliver's sisters. Maggie and Tom don't like Mrs. Glegg because she is always yelling at them for being naughty and saying that they will end up in trouble. But both kids like to play with their sweet and pretty cousin Lucy Dean. Maggie gets so angry when Mrs. Glegg says mean things about her long, dark hair that she goes upstairs and cuts it off with scissors. But she quickly regrets it because all the adults start making fun of her. During this same bad trip, Mr. Tulliver and Mrs. Glegg have a fight. So, Mr. Tulliver chooses to try to pay back the money Mrs. Glegg gave to the family. He doesn't want to be in debt to anyone, especially not his wife's sister. Mrs. Tulliver goes to see her sister, Mrs. Pullet, for help. She wants to stop Mr. Tulliver and Mrs. Glegg from fighting. Maggie, on the other hand, makes a fool of herself during the stay. She doesn't like that Tom and Lucy are playing without her, so she pushes Lucy into the mud, which scares the adults. Maggie feels so rejected that she runs away to live with the gypsies. That same day, the gypsies bring her back to her parents. Mr. Tulliver goes to see his sister, Mrs. Moss, because she owes him a lot of money and he wants to get it back. But he doesn't have the heart to ask her for money because she is poor and has 8 kids to feed. Instead, he borrows a lot of money to pay Mrs. Glegg back. Tom has a pretty bad time at school with Mr. Stelling. Latin and mathematics, which Mr. Stelling tries to teach him because he thinks they are gentlemanly subjects, are not good for him. During the Christmas break, Mr. Tulliver sues his neighbor, Mr. Pavart, for supposedly using too much of his water power. Mr. Wackham is a smart and successful lawyer who works for Pavart. Mr. Tulliver has grown to really dislike Wackham, so Tom is surprised when he goes back to school and finds that one of his classmates is Mr. Wackham's son, Philip. Unlike Tom, Philip is good at studying on his own. Tom looks down on Philip, though, because he has a physical handicap. Maggie and Philip bond over their love of books when she goes to see Tom before she goes to boarding school. Tom gets hurt while playing sword fights, and Philip helps him get better. Tom and Maggie's school days end quickly, though, when Maggie tells Tom that Mr. Tulliver lost the case with Mr. Pavart and will lose his mill, money, and land. He also fell off his horse and is now so sick that he doesn't know anyone except Maggie. Now that Mr. Tulliver's expenses are so high, he has to file for bankruptcy and sell the family's belongings. This is embarrassing for Tom, who is now in charge of the house, and very upsetting for Mrs. Tulliver, who loves her linens, furniture, and other home goods. Even with all of these problems, Tom chooses to do what Mr. Tulliver wants and not ask Mrs. Moss for the loan back. He even throws away the note that shows Mr. Tulliver gave Mrs. Moss money so that she won't have to pay back the money. Tom then goes to see his rich uncle Mr. Dean to ask for a job with the shipping company Guest & Company. He is determined to get rich and pay off the family's bills. But his uncle says Tom won't be able to get a job unless he knows how to do accounting and keep books. He says Tom's schooling in being a gentleman won't help him get a job. Mr. Wackham wants to get back at Mr. Tulliver, so he buys Dorlcote Mill and keeps Mr. Tulliver on as an employee. This plan is very embarrassing, but Mr. Tulliver agrees to it because he needs to support his family. But he asks Tom to swear in the family Bible that he will get back at the Wackhams one day. After the bankruptcy, things are bad at Dorlcote Mill. Mr. Tulliver is sad and angry, and Tom works all the time because he is so focused on making enough money to pay off the family's bills. Maggie is lonely and wants someone to talk to, so she meets Philip in secret in the woods behind the mill. Philip tells her he loves her, and she tells him she feels the same way. But after a year of meeting in secret, Tom finally finds out and is very angry. Tom gets angry with Philip and tells Maggie that she can't see Philip again unless Tom gives her permission. A few weeks later, Tom tells his family that he has finally made enough money to pay off the family's bills. He did this by investing with his old friend Bob Jakin in a shipping business. Tom tells the creditors that they will be paid back at a dinner at a nearby pub. After 4 years of hard work and pain, Mr. Tulliver is very happy that night about his win. On the way back to Dorlcote Mill, he runs into Mr. Wackham and tells him he won't work for him anymore. Mr. Tulliver's long-held anger finally comes out, and he strikes Mr. Wackham violently, whipping him with his horsewhip. Soon after that, Mr. Tulliver falls down and gets very sick. Before he dies, he tells Tom to get back the old mill. Since Dorlcote Mill was destroyed, Tom has been staying with Bob, and Maggie has started working as a teacher. Maggie meets Lucy's admirer and heir to the guest and co-wealth, the charming Stephen Guest, when she goes to Lucy's house. Maggie and Stephen are attracted to each other right away, but they try to hold back their feelings out of respect for Lucy and Philip, who comes to the Dean house to try to get back together with Maggie. Philip tells Maggie again that he loves her, and he even convinces Mr. Wackham to sell Dorlcote Mill back to Guest and Company, so that Tom can once again own the mill. But Tom still doesn't want Philip and Maggie to get married, no matter how hard they try to get along. Maggie, on the other hand, still has trouble dealing with her feelings for Stephen and Philip's growing jealousy and suspicion. Stephen kisses her arm at a ball at the guest house, and she runs away from him. Stephen comes to see her while she is living with her aunt Mrs. Moss. He tells her he loves her and says that if they love each other, they shouldn't marry other people. Maggie keeps fighting him and tells him that she can't make herself happy by making other people sad. But one day, Stephen and Maggie go out on the river by themselves in a boat. Stephen rows far away from St. Ogg's on purpose, and then he proposes to Maggie that they run away and get married. Maggie is shocked, but she decides to go with him to a nearby town called Mudport. Once they get there, though, she leaves him and takes a bus back to St. Ogg's, even though he says they've gone too far to turn around now. Back in St. Ogg's, Maggie runs to Tom for support because she has been shamed. But he doesn't think of her as his sister and tells her that her behavior is disgusting. So, Maggie moves in with her mother and Bob Jakin. She works as a governess for the kind town minister, Dr. Ken, but she doesn't fit in at St. Ogg's. Since she came back without being married, people think she slept with Stephen before they were married and judge her for it. Stephen writes a letter to Lucy saying that Maggie had nothing to do with the escape. Lucy goes to see Maggie and tells her she's sorry. Philip also writes a letter to Maggie in which he tells her he still loves her and that he believes what she says. Maggie wakes up one night after several days of heavy rain to find that the river has broken through the walls and flooded St. Ogg's. She runs to a boat and rows by herself to Dorlcote Mill to save Tom. Tom is surprised that his sister came all by herself to save him, and they have a touching talk on the boat. But as they kiss, they get caught in the current and die. In the end, Stephen, Lucy, and Philip go to Tom and Maggie Tulliver's shared grave, where it says, in their death, they were not divided.
About the author. Marian Evans, who later became famous under the pen name George Eliot, was born to Robert and Christiana Evans in Nuneaton, Warwickshire, England. Evans wasn't pretty by the standards of her time, like Maggie in the mill on the Floss. Mary Evans' parents gave her an education, which was unusual for young girls at the time, because they were afraid she wouldn't be able to find a husband. Evans kept learning on her own after she turned 16. She used the many books in the library of the house where her father worked to teach herself new things. In 1951, she became the assistant editor of the Westminster Review, a left-leaning magazine. This was an unusual job for a woman at the time. Many of her best-known books, like Adam Bede, 1859, The Mill on the Floss, 1860, Silas Marner, 1861, Middlemarch, 1871-72, and Daniel Deronda, 1876, are about how people in small towns feel on the inside. Evans said that she used a male pen name so that the literary establishment would take her writing seriously. At the time, women's writing was often seen as light pleasure by the literary establishment. Evans led a strange life. She lived with a married writer, George Henry Lewes, even though neither of them were married. Because of this, she didn't talk to her brother Isaac for a long time.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.